Welcome to the Infrastructure webinar series with Clean Water for All. My name is Sean Jackson. I'm with American Rivers, and I'm the state lead for our Pennsylvania field team. The webinar series, first discussion that we did was a policy breakdown of all the infrastructure working group's priorities, and our most recent webinar was an in-depth conversation on the practice of blending. If you would like either of those recordings, please send me an email or a message. I can be reached at sjackson@americanrivers.org. Jackson's just as it sounds. Today we have a great discussion for you. We're going to be going over the political landscape surrounding water infrastructure with the 2019 Congress and what opportunities there are for us to engage as a coalition. Our speaker today is Chad Lord. Chad serves as the Senior Director for the National Parks Conservation Association's Waters Program. He also serves as the co-lead for our Federal Policies Working Group, along with Madeline Foote of the League of Conservation Voters. Prior to working with NPCA, Chad has had a rich history working on environmental issues, including working as the Senior Legislative Assistant to Representative Betty McCollum, working with her on energy, environment, transportation, international trade, and budget and appropriations. He's here today to share his expertise on the current political landscape and offer us with some steps forward as a coalition regarding water infrastructure. We will have time for questions and answers, so if you have any questions, just fill them out in the box on the right-hand corner of the little notification system that you have set up from the program, and we'll try to answer them to the best of our ability during that allotted time. This webinar will be recorded and sent out to the listserv shortly after the presentation. We hope to have at least 2 more of these, and they are currently slated for the first Thursday of the next couple months. Right now, we're working on one webinar on equity issues and environmental justice with water infrastructure, and one on funding water infrastructure. But today should be a very informative session, and I'm so happy Chad was able to take his time to put it together for us. Without further ado, I present to you Chad Lord. The floor is yours, Chad.
Thank you, Sean. As Sean said, I am Chad Lord. I am a Senior Director for Water Policy at the National Parks Conservation Association. And for those of you who may not be familiar with NPCA, we're a 100-year-old organization whose mission is to preserve and protect national parks. Some of you may be wondering why a national parks group is interested in water infrastructure. Well, it's pretty, for us, simple. Many of our national parks are impacted by failing water systems around the country. And so for us, in order to protect the water quality in national parks around the country, we do need to support improving water infrastructure in our nation's communities. The other hat I wear is also as the policy director for the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition, a coalition of over 150 non-governmental organizations who came together over 10 years ago to preserve and protect the Great Lakes. And as anyone probably thinks about the Great Lakes region, it's an older region with a lot of water infrastructure issues. And so I do water infrastructure for that coalition as well and come to it from that perspective. Today, I hope to talk about a few things. I want to first just describe how I'm defining water infrastructure so we all start with on the same page. I then want to talk about who is important in this debate from a congressional and administrative perspective, so folks understand and have a bit of a sense as to who some of the targets would be as we're thinking about political and legislative action or policy action as it may be in the administration. I want to talk to about when we may be expecting action and what kinds of action we may see this year as it relates to Congress in particular. And then I want to cover some ideas around what folks can be doing to help influence the debate here in Washington. And I will be focused very much at the federal level. I will not be talking about state or local level efforts, although I would suggest that the types of things that one puts together for federal action can very easily be translated for whatever advocacy or activity people have in mind for state and local efforts. What I won't be talking about, which is what I think was talked about on the last webinar, was why this conversation is important. Other than to say, we all, I think, can recognize that our nation is faced with very large deferred maintenance backlog on improving our water infrastructure. The EPA has documented billions of dollars over the next 20 years that are needed just to get us up to standards. And so a very important and timely discussion, as we'll talk about in just a little bit. So when I talk about water infrastructure, I just want to be clear what it is I'm referring to, and what I hope folks have in mind when we talk about this issue. It's generally about our community's plumbing, so the delivery of safe, affordable drinking water, the safe elimination of wastewater, and the reduction and control of stormwater. So making sure that water is affordable, accessible, and safe for people to drink, but also as part of the safe elimination and reduction and control, there are other issues that I also always think about as it relates to the discussion around improving water infrastructure in our communities, which includes adaptation to climate change, the introduction to green infrastructure and what that might mean for neighborhoods and communities, as well as the reduction of stormwater runoff and water quality. And then also co-benefits to improving water infrastructure, like community development, streetscapes, jobs, local hiring, those kinds of issues that in my mind are also part of the discussion around how we improve our water infrastructure for the benefit of everyone in our communities. So who is it that is really kind of the people who are influencers in this debate? Well, in the Trump administration, or any administration for that matter, there are a couple of agencies that I just want to highlight because they are important players in this discussion. The Office of Wastewater Management at the in the Office of Water at the US EPA, also the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water, also at the US EPA, are two significant offices at that agency. The Office of Wastewater Management deals with the state revolving fund. They look at things like combined sewer overflows or sanitary sewer overflows. They look at stormwater runoff. That is the office that also is highlighting green infrastructure as well. So that is an important office at the US EPA for the wastewater or the elimination of wastewater systems. And obviously, I think stated in the title, the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water is just that. It's the office that deals with drinking water, both setting the standards and the protection of drinking water. So here, this is an office that is talking about, lead and copper rule and PFAS and other contaminants that may be poisoning drinking water systems around the country. I note, just by way of identifying some funding mechanisms that are important to many communities that they use to improve their wastewater, drinking water, and stormwater systems. The state revolving funds and the WIFIA program are both under EPA, and those are the sources of money out of EPA that communities use to finance their systems. The SRFs in particular are pretty flexible revolving loan funds where communities can borrow money from those funds and then repay it back. The funds can be used for a lot of different types of activities, not just the improvements of pipes and wastewater treatment plants and other kinds of systems, but also they can fund green infrastructure and security systems and other systems for that. And there are also, depending on the state, opportunities to have multiple kind of financing mechanisms. I understand it. Just a caveat: I am not an expert on SRF financing, and there are people in the coalition that are, and I would defer financing questions to those members. But what I do know and what I've seen is that the SRFs are very flexible and can be used for improvements, along with the new WIFIA program, which also is a caveat I'm not an expert on, but I do know funds some infrastructure improvements. Some other agencies that you may not think of when you think of water infrastructure, the Army Corps has some authority to help with communities and their infrastructure, water infrastructure. USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, their focus, as you could probably imagine, is very much on rural water systems, and they do fund rural water system improvements, and so that is also a place to think about, especially for smaller rural communities and rural water systems. And then the Department of Housing and Urban Development and other agencies, HUD in particular, through their community development block grants, can also fund, can include water and sewer systems as part of that. So those are just kind of a breadth of at least federal agencies that have some role. My experience personally is with the US EPA, and in my experience is that they are kind of the lead agency of the federal agencies and has the most money that can be used. But the other agencies do have some resources available to help communities improve their drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems as well. When we look at Congress, starting with the U.S. House of Representatives, there are a couple of key committees in the House of Representatives that I just wanted to identify for you all. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is responsible for oversight of the Clean Water Act, so wastewater in particular and stormwater. That would be the committee that would provide oversight and look at legislation and to address those issues. The Subcommittee on Water Resources and the Environment of that committee is an important subcommittee. I'll talk about why these are important in a minute. The other committee that in the House of Representatives that is important is the Energy and Commerce Committee, and that committee is focused on drinking water. As you can see, the House splits drinking water and clean water and stormwater into two different committees, which does create a bit of a legislating problem because it's sometimes difficult to combine water infrastructure into one package given the different jurisdictions in multiple committees. So that is something to think about. In the Senate, the jurisdiction for the Clean Water Act and Stormwater and the Drinking Water Act are all under the Environment and Public Works Committee. And so that committee has joint jurisdiction of all of those issues. The other committees in both the House and Senate is the Appropriations Committees. In particular, the Interior and Environment Subcommittee, which handles EPA and the Department of the Interior, and the Energy and Water Committee, which deals with the Army Corps of Engineers. I did not list, but will mention that if the HUD budget is under the Transportation and Housing and Urban Development Appropriations Subcommittee, and USDA's rural money is under the Department of Agriculture. Appropriations. So there are 4 committees, but the 2 main ones are the ones I've listed. Why do I mention these committees? Well, because the folks, as we get into a discussion around what we can be doing, oftentimes people will ask who to target, who are those decision makers that are most important when it comes to this debate. And congressionally, the committees that I have identified here for you would serve as kind of your first place to look at and to see who is on those committees, and as if you were looking at targeting messages, because these are the committees that will look at legislation, look at these issues first before all members of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate will be asked to vote. So in terms of targeting for political purposes and policy purposes, this is where one would start both in the House and the Senate. I will, just as a bit of an aside, appropriations is pretty straightforward. That's where the funding gets appropriated for the programs at the US EPA, at USDA, at the Army Corps, and HUD and other agencies. And so the Appropriations Committee is who provides the funding. But the policy decisions are mostly made at the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. So policy decisions in terms of how much budget authority these programs are going to have, how the money can be spent on what, how they're going to address various issues like green infrastructure or affordability or some of these other policy areas that are associated with the water infrastructure discussion would be handled by these what are called authorizing committees: the Environment and Public Works Committee, Transportation and Infrastructure, and Energy and Commerce in the House of Representatives. And so that's kind of how the issues get split up: funding with appropriations and policy authorizations, policy setting, in the other places, and the other committees. I had hoped to be able to show you who's on those committees, but those the 116th Congress just having started, those committees have not organized yet. They are still assigning members to those committees. In particular, in the House, given the switch in parties, the Democrats now have more seats to fill. The Republicans have fewer seats, so members will be dropping off the committees, members will be shifting committees. And so we don't yet have a full official list of who is going to be on these committees when one is starting to begin to think about targeting. There is people are beginning to come forward, and I've seen some things of members who are being nominated for committees on energy and commerce and appropriations in particular, but there's no official, nothing's been finalized yet in terms of who those people are. I would expect that final decisions on committee assignments will be made in the House of Representatives in particular in the next couple of weeks. So by the end of January, all the committees should have pretty much all of their new members, and that folks can see that by looking at the committee website membership lists. The Senate has also done some rearranged its committee assignments as well, and all of that has been, I think, finalized for the most part. And there too, you can go to the committee websites and look at the membership lists of who is on that to see if your member of Congress or senator is on one of these key committees. So just a little bit about what we can expect to see happening and when. I just wanted to provide a little bit of just review of what happened last year because it does influence, I think, what we may likely see this year. So many of you may have followed the debate on America's Infrastructure Act, S3021, or otherwise known as WRDA. It was the vehicle that carried the Water Resources Development Act, which authorizes many core programs. But as in 2016, it also included policy changes for how EPA addresses and deals with drinking water. And some, not comprehensively, but there were some important changes, most of which were focused, infrastructure provisions, most of which were focused on drinking water. And so there was a big drinking water section, increasing the amount of money that's available, if appropriated, to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, for example, and making a number of other changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act to make the program more flexible or responsive. It also included a few provisions addressing clean water, wastewater, and stormwater, but not nearly as many. And so the reason why I wanted to mention it is that there were a number of provisions that were left out on the clean water and wastewater side. And there were some things also just not addressed on the drinking water side. So that does provide some opportunities for Congress to revisit those issues. So what can we expect for this year? There has been quite a bit of discussion in the press and among members in the House of Representatives in particular, that they want to move forward with developing an infrastructure bill. The bill that has been talked about is larger than just water infrastructure, and would also include surface transportation, so your highways, roads, and bridges, perhaps aviation, so your potentially airports, broadband systems and energy systems, perhaps, depending on how big they get, but also water systems, improving drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems as well as part of that package. The reporting and conversations I know I've had suggest that there is that the committees have been instructed to come up with that House package sometime by May of this year. Obviously, deadlines can slip, but that is certainly, I think, the overall time frame that the U.S. House of Representatives and its committees are working under. And so, things that we could start seeing that folks should be aware of is, I think there is an interest, at least at the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which is the committee I've been in closer contact with, is that they would like to begin to do some hearings on the issues and begin to really explore infrastructure questions. And I do know water infrastructure is been identified as one of those areas they want to look at, and especially the impacts water infrastructure is having on communities from just from an aging infrastructure perspective, but also an affordability perspective. And so there will likely be some hearing. We could start seeing some hearings once the committee is organized by the end of this month, sometime in February or March. So that is something to keep your eyes open for. And I think it suggests that there is at least a great deal of interest in the new House of Representatives under the new leadership to really move these infrastructure issues forward and really examine them and try to develop legislation on the issues. There's also always the appropriations process. So the president's budget will come out. The president will recommend how much money he would like to see for the programs and the agencies that we already talked about. That budget is typically supposed to come out the first Monday in February. So if that is true, then February 4th may be the day. Although with the current government shutdown or partial shutdown, and the fact that Congress has not yet finished appropriations for the current fiscal year, it's unclear whether or not this administration will be able to keep that deadline and produce a budget on time. Regardless, they will likely produce a budget at some point and propose funding for stormwater, drinking water, and stormwater infrastructure improvements. In the past, they've held those accounts, at least at EPA, through the state revolving funds, somewhat at similar levels that have been appropriated in the past, but past is not prologue, and it's unclear whether or not they will continue to do that moving forward. But so we'll see that, and then the Congress will then have to figure out what it wants to appropriate and fund for the various programs that can help communities improve their drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. And so that process is supposed to kick off in early February and then kind of move through February, March, April, and May. But given the partial shutdown and the current debate around the lack of appropriations for the current fiscal year for EPA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other departments, that timeline may get upended a bit. But it is a timeline folks should be aware of and be watching if folks want to influence at least the amount of money that is available to communities to do the improvements. I do want to pause for a bit of a reality check, however, from a political perspective. While I've talked about the introduction of bills in the House, first of all, I personally have not picked up any real equivalent priority among Senate Republican leaders to move or introduce legislation. That may just be that I'm not talking to the right people, but most of the infrastructure discussion and priority seems to be coming out of the new leadership in the House of Representatives. And so that's just something to keep in mind, because obviously the Senate will have to act if there is to be any legislation that gets enacted into law. Even if an infrastructure package is introduced legislatively, the question I am always grappling with is what is the likelihood of enacting something into law, and that is more questionable. Um, Obviously there could be parts of a package that would be able to hitch rides on other legislative vehicles. I already mentioned WRDA last year as being a model potentially for some water infrastructure provisions, and WRDA is slated to come up again in 2020. But it's not clear, if what the appetite will be to add some of those provisions onto WRDA, and so that is just something what folks will have to pay attention to, and regardless of regardless of the form that legislation may take, as I already noted, at least House committees seem eager to look at this issue through hearings, and that it would include water infrastructure, not only the state of disrepair, as already mentioned, but other issues of affordability and related issues. There still remains the question of, even if the House is able to act, what will the Senate do? I do not have a good sense, although I do know many senators recognize the problem of infrastructure in this country, and I think if they had their way, would probably want to move something. But there continue to be, big questions that hold things up beyond just the larger politics that are playing out right now, and how that might influence people's willingness to work with the administration, which also has a role to play in trying to set infrastructure priorities. And they also would have to the president would have to sign something, but there are budget implications. These programs, funding this is very expensive. Where are they going to find that money? Is it going to be deficit spending? Is it going to come from some other source? If it comes from some other source to offset that spending, what is that source? There aren't that many big sources of money available, so how are you going to pay for it? Surface transportation has the gas tax. Will that be increased for surface transportation? Is there an equivalent type of tax that could be applied to help improve wastewater, drinking water, and stormwater? So it's just not. So the budget implications too could prove to be too much for Congress in order to be able to move some sort of infrastructure package that actually would address the huge needs that communities are facing as it relates to all of their infrastructure, not just water, but all of it, including water systems. So, these could be potentially significant headwinds in order to move legislation. I personally remain optimistic and am working in that kind of frame of mind, because we do have a lot of people, at least in the House of Representatives, that know water infrastructure needs to be repaired and want to do something about it. So I think we have a real opportunity, even if we are unable to pass legislation this year in the 116th Congress, setting things up to really make some progress potentially in future years if this year turns out to not be, we turn out not to be successful in moving something forward. So that leads me to my last kind of part of the discussion that I want to talk about, which is what can be done. And I'm just going to offer some of my thoughts, and this is not by any means universal, but just some things that I've seen, both from my experience as someone who worked for a member of Congress, but also now been doing kind of advocacy on the non-Hill side for a number of years. Things that I've seen to be successful, and I would think would be valuable for folks to think about. And I know that the Clean Water for All Coalition has been thinking about as well. Storytelling. I'm a big fan of stories. I'm a big fan of storytelling. I'm a big fan of storytellers. And I think having stories that describe the current state of disrepair and of water, drinking water, stormwater, and wastewater systems and its impacts on families. So that would include disrepair would include, what we're seeing in communities around lead. That would include the emerging crisis around PFAS and other contaminants. That would just include, old systems that have combined sewer overflows. That would include all of those things as part of how that impacts families. That would also include, how costly these repairs are and how families cannot shoulder the burden of rate increases to pay for those. The affordability of water that would include the impacts would include the affordability of that water to ensure that every person in our communities has access to safe, affordable water. And so those are the stories that could be told about the impacts. And then there are, the community solutions. I have seen communities, primarily in the Great Lakes, which is where I do a lot of work, but also in other parts of the country that are doing really interesting things around the introduction of green infrastructure to deal with stormwater runoff, and solutions that are having dramatic impacts on basement flooding and other problems that families have faced. I've seen places, and I've heard stories of where communities are working with their utilities to do community benefit agreements, and working with local utilities to look at how to do more local hiring of more women-owned or other owned businesses, local businesses, job training, that sort of thing. So there are those stories where these lessons could be described for policymakers in Washington, to see if there are any opportunities to revise federal policy to really support those local community-driven initiatives to really benefit neighborhoods and communities across the country. That leads me to my last, so communication, talking to these decision makers. I know I personally love to have folks come to DC, and there hopefully will be opportunities for folks through the Clean Water for All Coalition, but also other coalition efforts that you may be a part of, to come to Washington and talk to your members of Congress or agencies about these issues and what you may be doing in your community that could serve as a model, what some of the roadblocks or hurdles are that you need to have cleared in order for you to be more effective in doing the work at the community level. So communicating that either through either through member visits here in Washington, or visiting member offices in districts, or writing a letter to them describing these things. All of that would fall under the communications bucket. Events, have events to highlight these things, these issues in your community, and obviously allies. So none of this is probably very surprising to most people. I just put it down because these are the things that I always like to think about when I'm talking about what can be done in order to influence decision makers. And so, people always are talking about who are the right messengers. I think people impacted by these issues are the right messengers, but I also think the utilities who are trying to provide clean, safe, affordable drinking water and wastewater services to families are also potentially good. And then other contractors and other people who actually help do the work could also be very, very good people to ally with and communicate these issues to the people who are making the decisions here in Washington. So that's what. So that's a bit of just kind of what I see, both what has kind of happened, who's important to this debate, and then my suggestions in terms of some of the things that people could be doing or assist with. But these are my suggestions, and folks, I love to hear from what other people have, or if folks have questions. I also know there are other people on this call that have much more policy background on some of these issues too, that I would hopefully be able to call on and turn to if folks have more specific policy questions that I may not be able to answer. So with that, Sean, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Chad. That was super informative, and I hope everyone got a lot out of that. We're going to open it up to questions now, and I hope that we can answer all of them, and I hope that everything gets put out and taken care of easily. One of the first questions we got in was the question of what could we do to influence the outcome right now, in the sense of when we're communicating with the representative that we've targeted or whatever, how do we communicate with them effectively as advocates?
Yeah, I hopefully provided some insight, but I think my training has always been, just state clearly at the very top what it is that you're looking for them to do, and then from there tell your story as to what the impacts are and how what you're suggesting would help solve that solution or solve that problem. The solution that you're seeking would help address that issue. To the extent that folks can be specific in the kinds of laws that you're seeking to amend, that's always helpful, but it's not required, especially if you are not. I mean, most normal people do not do that kind of, that's not, most normal people probably don't have that kind of background, and it's not definitely not necessary. I think what my experience has been is that when constituents are communicating with their members of Congress, the most valuable thing is to share what is happening to them on a personal level, and why people feel that they want their member of Congress to take a particular action. I would also just note, just by way of saying, the other thing, to the extent that there are these examples that you can incorporate into your communications, I have found through the work, especially we do in the Great Lakes region, but just generally, that showing members how to achieve results through the changes or through investments that might be being made right now is also a very effective tactic from a communications perspective. So showing them, okay, you've got these USDA dollars that are coming in, for example, or these US EPA dollars. What is that money being spent on, and how are those projects or programs having a direct impact on people in the community, is also very effective.
Great. I think that's helpful. And an additional question we had is, well, maybe this is more policy related, but hopefully we can answer it. But is there any avenue to use SRF or WIFIA or for O&M or asset management?
Yeah, that is. I think I'm to go on a limb. I don't think it funds O&M. Memory serves, there may be some ability to do some asset management, but I don't know for certain. I'm going to defer that question because I don't want to give anyone any wrong information. I do know the programs are very flexible. I just don't know if they're that flexible.
Great.
Perhaps when you guys talk about funding in your next webinar, that might be one of the questions you can try and address.
I think that it definitely will be something that we're going to address in our funding webinar. If there is anybody on that knows a more intricate answer, feel free to chime in the questions box and I'll answer that. Yeah, Gary, I'm seeing you have a raised hand. Maybe I can unmute you. Yeah, can you talk, Gary?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, I can't, I don't have a question box, well, actually, no, I do. Anyway, I'll ask my question. Sorry. So, Chad, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some thoughts about coalition strategy moving forward in terms of some of the new leadership in the House. You mentioned we're not necessarily going to see legislation passed, or might be a little bit longer slog because of the divided houses and the current political situation. What do you think our strategy could be, or some thoughts on how to build a strategy in that end, given the current political atmosphere, and how can we do that as a coalition, or effective ways of doing that from a coalition?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't want to leave people feeling that there's no hope. I was suggesting that there are some strong headwinds, but obviously the winds could change, and perhaps they could, not to murder the metaphor, but it could blow into the sails and sail this thing across the finish line. I think there are, generally speaking, the potentially most effective coalition strategy would be one around communications and storytelling. And what I mean is to really show and demonstrate for members of Congress who I already think are there in terms of understanding the need to address, especially giving communities more resources to deal with these issues, especially because I know a lot of members that I've spoken to understand that, cities in particular cannot keep raising rates on people. I mean, it's becoming unsustainable. So I think continuing to just provide, the stories that I described earlier for members of Congress and remind them that this is going on and that this is continuing to be, that this continues to need to be a priority, I think would be a very strong and smart strategy to pursue. I think that does a couple of things. I think it provides people with you're basically like the squeaky wheel will ultimately get the grease, right? And so, and then it also gives our allies, as I mentioned, I think most members of Congress know that this is a need. It gives them the evidence they need and the talking points they need from their community perspective to be able to weigh in. It doesn't allow them to ignore or forget about the problem, and that I think one of the challenges I've seen when talking about infrastructure in general is that when people talk about infrastructure, the first thing they go to are roads and bridges. I personally think it's because you can see roads and bridges. The stuff underground is just, it's out of sight, tends to get out of mind. So, the ability to continue to share what's going on in our communities through, whatever mechanism, a letter or email or fact sheet or press release or whatever, kind of doesn't allow for things to get hidden or buried, and that it just keeps reminding members and other decision makers that water infrastructure is equally as important, if not more important, because you actually need water for life. Yes, roads are important for life as well, for jobs and other issues, but it just makes it certain that we're not going to forget it. So in the long run, it just gives us an opportunity to just keep that drumbeat going. So when there are opportunities for members to move legislation, they've heard a consistent message that they need to make this a priority, and that they'll be ready to go when the political winds shift.
Great. Yeah, I think that was pretty useful. We do have an additional question. Where do you anticipate green or natural infrastructure is most likely to emerge, or are there opportunities to build it into legislation?
That is a great question. Green infrastructure tends to just be embedded in the discussion. We saw some of that in some of the Water proposals last year. It tends to just be, I think, naturally raised. I think many members see the value of green infrastructure, and so I think and it already is. I think it already is kind of embedded in the SRFs where certain amounts can be used for those purposes. And so, I think some of the opportunities where we could see, an expanded discussion around green infrastructure would potentially be around this conversation around asset management, not just water infrastructure asset management, but as communities are managing all of their assets, where could there be greater coordination between, for example, the departments of transportation and the water utilities? So as you're digging up roads, you could potentially be not only fixing the pipes below the roads, but also integrating green infrastructure along the roads. And I've seen some of that done in communities like Buffalo, New York. So I think there are opportunities along those lines that could be more enhanced or raised. I would note that the House of Representatives Congress, I believe, just passed at the end of last year a bill that had a green infrastructure promotion provision, basically requiring EPA to promote green infrastructure. So I mention that because I think green infrastructure is something that I've seen Congress, and it suggests to me that at least a lot of people in Congress see it as important, because I do see it pop up, but I think it is something that is definitely worth talking about frequently so no one forgets. And I don't know if I know, Gary, I heard you were on. I don't know if you have a different perspective or anyone else. This is just my observations, and I definitely don't want to. If others have other observations, we should get those out too.
Yeah. So if either Gary or someone else has an additional point to that, then feel free to raise your hand. I'll unmute you and you can speak to it. But yeah, I'll unmute you, Gary. There you go.
Now, I'll just, since Chad mentioned, I'll say I agree with Chad that I think it's just a matter of being strategic on where in any sort of legislation we get natural infrastructure and green infrastructure, and it can kind of vary depending on what we're talking about, whether it's green stormwater infrastructure, if it's buffer protection, or if it's sort of more conservation type work. It could end up in a couple different places, and so we just need to be strategic about how we do it. I think the important thing is, as Chad was mentioning too, is once we find those areas of legislation or those particular topics that we think are sort of the flags we want to wave, just continue hammering on it. And even though we might not get legislation passed this time around, keeping that top of mind and like any sort of messaging strategy is how you eventually win that. So you got to be looking at the long game. So I think I think we as a coalition, we have some priorities, and I think we can continue to look at strategic ways of including some of those priorities in specific pieces of legislation, or even innovative ways of including aspects of those in other places if we can't get full pieces.
Good. Thanks, Gary. So we do have one more question right now, which is there a good approach on affordability since the House drinking water and wastewater are handled in two different committees?
It's also a very good question. It's a little easier in the Senate because they can combine drinking water and wastewater into one approach, and we saw that last year. There were a couple of, well, they weren't really, I don't know if they were affordability fixes. They were more targeting assistance to low-income families who may be having issues and not necessarily addressing the overall affordability of the water themselves. But it was at least a step in trying to broaden the conversation around the affordability of water services to families. There was a couple of bills that were introduced, one early in the last Congress by Representative Marcia Fudge from Ohio, who introduced an assistance program to help people pay their wastewater bills. And then there was also legislation introduced by Senators Ben Cardin from Maryland and Roger Wicker from Mississippi, Mississippi, a Republican from Mississippi, and they expanded the approach Ms. Fudge had taken to make it broader in terms of the pilots that would be funded. The programs would fund pilot programs at utilities to help them either develop or expand their assistance programs. And also the Senate bill included both drinking water and wastewater. So it was a little bit easier. I don't know if I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know if I would characterize these bills as a component of the affordability conversation, but since it's more assistance, it doesn't necessarily get at directly how affordable the water actually is. That people have to pay, it just helps them pay it. So I think there is still more discussion, and I have heard that that conversation is likely to come up as part of these oversight hearings that the House at least wants to do.
Just realized I was muted. Good. Well, thanks, Chad. We don't have any more questions listed right now. I will remind everyone that we did have already two webinars that we've done previously as a part of this series. And if you want those recordings, you can email me at sjackson@americanrivers.org, and I can get them to you. But today was a really good discussion, and I think hopefully everyone learned a lot, and we can really go forward and try and hit this the new Congress with some informed advocates, and I think that's important. So thank you, Chad. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I will be sending out this recording within the next day or two to the listserv with the help of the coalition. And I hope that everyone that didn't get a chance will be able to get to have a listen. Next month, we will be doing another webinar, and that could either possibly be on equity and environmental justice or on funding. And that is slated for the first Thursday of the month, and that should be the case for for all of the webinars going forward. The only reason this was the second Thursday was due to the holidays, trying to make sure everyone was in the office and able to join. It was a good discussion today, and I look forward to hearing from all of you soon.